The picture should have stayed old. Instead, it began to collect things that didn't belong, like someone sneaking new coins into a grandfather's pocket when his back was turned. I first noticed it on a night so quiet the building seemed to be holding its breath. The museum's sodium lamps threw the galleries in a honeyed haze, everything soft at the edges. I was on my first cigarette of the shift, standing with my back to the 19th century photography case, watching the tiny digits on my Casio watch blink 12 like a patient animal. The plate was a tintype from 1873, face a woman seated with her hands folded, and at first glance she was perfectly of that century, dress high at the throat, hair piled in pins. Then I saw the band of black plastic around her wrist, the little rectangle of a Casio F91W, the same model I wore, only this one glowed faint and impossible on the silvered plate. It was wrong in the way a wrong thing can be, subtle, at first accusing me of being tired. I'd been working nights for nearly a year, after the divorce, after Wichita took the rest of my life with my daughter. The night shift fit into the leftover pieces of me, steady, nobody watching, quiet enough to think. People ask why anyone takes nights in a museum. They imagine ghosts. The truth is more pedestrian. Fewer questions, more time to sort thoughts, less chance of having to make small talk with someone who still has a life. The watch caught the gallery light and digitized like a secret. I remember leaning close until my breath fogged the glass, that tiny Casio display reflected in the silvered emulsion. I told myself a dozen times it's fatigue. I jotted it in a log, then shrugged it off, telling myself I'd double-check in the morning. There are things you tell yourself when you are trying to keep your life from tilting. By dawn, there was always something new. The next night, a thin white line like a lanyard threaded through the woman's fingers. 2 nights later, someone had added a paper coffee cup tucked into the lap, condensation mapped against the tin by hand as clean as a ghostly fingerprint. Over a week, the image accumulated modern detritus, sneakers peeking at the hem of her dress, an in-ear bud, a scrap of a receipt with a year printed on it that hadn't existed when the plate was made. The changes were never sloppy. They arrived like offerings, small, detachable things that belonged to no era, until they belonged to hers. I told Dr. Elizabeth Grant the morning she came in. She is the curator, practical, the kind of person who keeps the collection's old accession book neat, and whose laughter sounds like metal keys. She squinted, tilted the glass under a repro light, and then sent for Professor Harold Tanneho.
Harold's lab smelled like fixer and old paper. He had a pair of lenses magnified like an owl's, and when he held them to the plate, his mouth tightened in a way I had seen only twice before. The first time was when my daughter left, and the second was when my father died. Harold confirmed what we were afraid to hope for. The plate was authentic, not a later copy, not a clever forgery. The emulsion, the chemical staining, the peculiarities of wet plate collodion all said 1873, every microscopic inconsistency pointing back to that year. He ran the plate through his narrow instruments, looking for retouches, for later varnish, for the needle marks of a faker. He found none. When he finally looked up, he didn't choke. He just said, "We don't have an explanation." We didn't know where to go from there. We called people who could make things sound sensible. Conservators, chemists, a retired historian at the State University. When that couldn't stretch into an answer, Dr. Leonard Pratt came. They call him a physicist, but temporal anomalies keeps his better half of the department awake at night. Leonard had a way of speaking like he wanted to build a machine out of his sentences, and he treated the plate like an engineering problem, every mystery something that could be mapped and reduced. He brought a theory that smelled of meteor dust and old silver. He referred to a small meteorite field outside of town. People wrote it down as Brenham on old survey maps. Others called it Brenna in more recent notes, an inconsistency that made him smile a private smile and say it didn't help the matter. For our purposes, he called it the site. According to Leonard, there was an unusual concentration of meteoritic particulates in the silver used by certain itinerant photographers in the 1870s. The contamination altered the electromagnetic properties of the silver emulsion in ways that, if you squinted towards the speculative, might permit a sort of temporal resonance. He said resonance like it was a word you could put in your pocket. "That's not science," one of the conservators said, which made Leonard's jaw go flat. He was careful to call it a hypothesis. He said we were dealing with something that reacted to attention and observation, something that could form a bridge of sorts if conditions aligned, emulsion composition, a certain pattern of light and focus, and human attention. He used analogies, a bell plucked at a precise pitch, a feedback loop that fed on differences between presence and captured stillness. In Leonard's model, attention was the sort of fuel that could let the image pull on time. He also used a different, quieter word, guardian. He didn't mean guardian in a sentimental way a plaque talks about donors. He meant a thing that fed on the energy of displacement, that preferred frozen moments and kept them frozen because they tasted like unfinished time. He didn't say it as a creature of spirit or of God.
He said it as a system, an emergent property of the contaminated plates, something the plates and those looking at them had inadvertently created. At that point, Dr. Grant did the practical thing and sat down with a legal pad. Harold wrote authenticity confirmed. Leonard drew circles and coils and wrote resonant silver meteorite contamination. And then they handed me a typed sheet, weighty as a verdict. There were 5 rules. Leonard said them without theatrics, as if they'd come out of a lab manual, and as if their precise wording mattered. Rule 1. Do not enter the affected gallery after hours. Rule 2. Do not answer voices calling from inside once the museum is closed. Rule 3. Cover or remove all reflective surfaces in the gallery and adjacent rooms. Rule 4. Do not, under any circumstances, take photographs of plates made before 1900 or allow yourself to be photographed with them. Rule 5. If you see yourself in person in an image, close your eyes immediately and count down from 50. They printed them a second time and left copies with the night housekeeping log, taped them to the back of the security desk. You could call them superstition made tidy. You could call them instructions from someone who had looked straight at a problem and decided to reduce variables. Either way, they read like the rules for a life that had been divorced from ordinary certainties and stapled to procedures. If that sounds overly dramatic for rules about preserved photos, remember the woman with the Casio, or the coffee cup, or the sneakers. Anyone who saw sequence in the changing plate saw it as an escalation. For me, the rules were both absurd and necessary, like a splint you apply to a broken animal leg before you know whether the animal will survive. After the first list, I found myself reciting Rule 1 in my head like a prayer as I locked the galleries at night. Do not enter the affected gallery after hours. It fit the night shift like a glove. Keep away, keep witness at a distance. Yet there were nights when the museum felt thin and dangerous, nights when keeping away felt like abandoning someone to a slow cruelty. My daughter is in Wichita now. She likes to text pictures of clouds and of her teeth. She sends a photograph of herself smiling on a Tuesday, and the small gravity of that image pulls at me. Sometimes grief is an ache that wants proof, and proof is a dangerous thing in the museum. That first month, I followed the rules like a new religion. I covered brass plaques, swabbed glass with old linen, removed a standing mirror from the Victorian parlor, and shoved it into a storage crate that smelled like cedar. I logged each alteration in the book. I made the rounds beneath the sodium glow, my Casio a dull heartbeat on my wrist. I taped the plates case with archival tape every night and unsealed it in the morning like a reluctant ritual. The changes still happened.
The tests were small at first, subtle probes meant to measure my adherence but doubling as threats. Rule 2 is the one that most people imagine when something like this happens, the eerie knock, the voice on the other side of an old door. That's how the Guardian liked to begin, mimicry and small mercies. It was shortly after midnight. Wind had pushed a line of cold through the building. The old draft made the lights flicker like a tired throat. I was 3 paces from the Victorian hallway when the knock came. 3 slow raps, then 4 quick ones. The sort of irregular pattern my mother used to make when she wanted to get my attention without waking the house. The sound was exact. My hands went cold. Rule 2 was a list in my head. Do not answer voices calling from inside once the museum is closed, and it pulsed there with the metronome of my watch. Wyatt? The voice from the other side said my name in the curve of my mother's vowels. In my head I saw her hair smell of lemon and Haviland soap, saw the small scar above my left eyebrow where I had once split my head falling off my bicycle. I hadn't heard her voice in the same arrangement since the funeral. It was more than data. It was a small, surgical longing. I put my palm flat on the doorframe and felt the ridges of the wood under my hand. The rational part of me catalogued the options. A prowler, a prank, a wiring fault causing an intercom to feedback, a mimic created by some electronics. The part of me that had been a boy in a house that loved him wanted to step across the threshold and open the door. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I pressed my face against the cold door and let the sound wash over me. My breath fogged the slat. The voice kept calling, changing phrases, bringing up small family details the Guardian didn't have to know to hurt me, the way my daughter used to break her collarbone, the name of the dog from my childhood. Each detail landed like a pebble, and then the Guardian escalated, low, patient humming vibrating from the wood. It wanted me to open the door. It wanted my attention.
Rule 2 is blunt and ugly in its efficiency. Do not answer voices. It saves you from the first soft lie that leads to deeper commitment. It keeps the line around you from getting tangled. The rule works because the guardian feeds on attention, not on brute force. Open the door, and you risk letting the bridge take hold. Stay outside, and you may save someone inside from the consolation of surrender. The temptation passed like morning fog. I walked the perimeter, the Casio buzzing like a nervous insect on my wrist. When I came back a half hour later, the knock had stopped. The sound scoured like a hand through dust. I left a note in the log. No entry. Knock at 0014. Voice resembling mother. Monitored. The curators did not mock me. They added the sentence to the incident file and stapled it. We had no protocol for voices borrowing loved ones' teamses.
The telephone calls started the following week. They were more bureaucratic in their cruelty. Phones in the museum are old things, patched to the front desk and to the emergency line. We generally didn't get personal calls. The number only rang if someone needed a track-down artifact or an anxious donor. The first call came in at 0203, display broadcasting the home number of my ex-wife. My hand shook when I picked up. "Wyatt," a voice said, flat as a coin. I could hear a plane, or pretending to hear a plane, something in the soundscape that made the voice sound both immediate and terribly distant. This voice had my daughter's name, the name we used for her when she was a small, private thing. "She needs you. Come home." I stayed on the line long enough to keep the call alive. Rule 1 said do not enter the affected gallery after hours, which was easy to follow because it required the simple physical act of not going in. It didn't speak to this. Calls meant to thaw isolation. Rule 4 said do not take photographs of plates made before 1900, which felt unrelated until the voice suggested I needed a photograph to prove my love, that if I took one with my daughter, it would fix something. The guardian used my hunger for repair as bait, turning my better instincts against me. I didn't go. I logged the call as fraudulent, believed to be mimicry. Dr. Grant called it social engineering. Leonard called it attention exploitation, with the slide of a man who prefers equations to bedside manners. For both, the label did nothing to make the voice less real. In the artless way it convinced me I could still be useful. The third test was the mirror. Rule 3 is practical to the point of tedium. Cover or remove reflective surfaces. It is also the rule I failed to take seriously the longest. Mirrors and polished brass are everywhere in a museum, with silver and frames and glass, tiny traps. Covering them makes the building feel like a place where the light has been muzzled. I would sometimes leave one uncovered because it looked like overreaction, or because late at night I wanted to check my own face, the scar, the gray at my temples, the tired weight, and feel like something in me was still true. One night in late November, snow clung to the windows, and the gallery smelled like dust and varnish. I passed a side room with a long, narrow, convex mirror at its end, an object whose glass had been a curiosity for tours, warped to flatten the room and fetch the face into a small, coy distance. The mirror had been left uncovered. I don't remember why. Maybe maintenance forgot. Maybe I had been careless. Maybe the museum had been busy and nobody thought to check the second-tier rooms. I saw my face, or rather a suggestion of my face, at the edge of the mirror. At first it was just that, a glance, a half-thought. Then my reflection blinked at a different beat than I did.
It raised its fingers and tapped the glass from the inside, like someone worried about condensation on a window. The reflected me mouthed something I couldn't hear, something like, "Help me," but the lips didn't match the words I wanted them to shape. Rule 5 is the one that reads almost loony. If you see yourself in person in an image, close your eyes immediately and count down from 50. In the split second between sight and decision, I understood why. It is not the reflection itself that is dangerous. It's the recognition of the self as other, a bridge our minds are eager to cross. The mirror me wanted engagement. It wanted me to meet its eyes. The rules were blunt instruments against a temptation no one welcomes. I wasn't thinking of rules. I was thinking of my daughter's face on my phone, of the way she would curl into sleep. And suddenly I felt like my own face in that glass wasn't mine alone. I felt stranded, like a thing split by a bad seam. I closed my eyes because the rule told me to, and I counted silent numbers under my breath, each number a tiny defibrillator shock. 50 felt like a very long number. By the time I reached 10, my hands were sweating. When I opened my eyes, the mirror showed the gallery empty and dull and ordinary. The tapping had stopped. Those incidents would be the sort of things you could explain away if you wanted to sleep. But the plate kept accumulating modern artifacts, always in small, cruelty-graced steps. After Harold confirmed authenticity, after Leonard explained resonance and meteorite particulate,
We formed a small group that met in the back office under a single fluorescent bulb. Dr. Grant directed us like a foreman marshalling a job site. Harold scrutinized the plate under his lamp. Leonard sketched circuits and coils on scrap paper. I took notes and made coffee, because that is what night watchmen do when they mean to look productive. There were people trapped in those images, or that was the hypothesis, which made the rules feel less like superstition and more like triage. Leonard did not want us saying trapped as a fact. He preferred temporal entrapment as an operational phrase, which made it sound less like a ghost story and more like geology. Still, he stopped using titles like specimen when we started discussing the possibility that human minds and bodies had been pulled across a thin, brittle bridge into silver and weighted.
What made it cruel, Leonard said, was that the Guardian, if you accept the shorthand, didn't imprison people in the way a cell holds a prisoner. It preserved them in a loop, a place where time folded into itself and consumption gave way to stasis. People inside didn't age the way they should. It was not torture in the usual sense. It was a denial that looked like mercy. It was the injunction against the natural ebb of grief and life. Those meetings began to change how I walked through the museum. I checked locks twice. I carried a small headlamp clipped to my jacket. I kept my Casio under my sleeve so the dim blue digits didn't catch the eye in a dark room. I stopped bringing my phone to parts of the building that smelled strongly of metallic varnish. And yet, the rules were not all deterrent. They asked for more than avoidance. They asked for an active watchfulness I had not expected. There was moral arithmetic in them. If we followed the rules, fewer people would be trapped in the first place. If we broke the rules, we risked adding to the count. Dr. Grant said it directly one night. We are the people who say no to curiosity. We sit with something beautiful and we do not touch it, because touching might mean stealing a person into sleep. Her voice cracked there, and I saw the weight of people in her head. Donors, descendants, those who had entrusted us with heirlooms. She had a practical grief that didn't need flights of metaphor. She wanted to catalog, isolate, and protect. I agreed with her, but the rulebook involved more than abstention. It required decisions: which plates to test, what to label as contaminated, how to keep the public safe without wringing the charm out of a museum that lived on encounters with the past. The first time the rules saved me was the night with the mailbox. A new anomaly had appeared on the plate, the woman holding a battered metal towel mug. The next day, a small mailbox, one of those painted red like a child's prop, sat in the gallery, leaning impossibly against the plinth. No one besides me had keys to that storage room. That night, someone knocked on the back door, a light, polite ring. I checked the log and saw no scheduled deliveries. Rule 1 told me not to enter the affected gallery after hours. The knock came again, and I thought of the woman's wrist, of the mug now in her hands. A small child voice called out, "Are you there? Please, open up. We need help." My hand tightened on the door latch, and for a second the watchman's code, "Do not put yourself in the way of something you cannot explain," was at war with the easy human answer that never leaves the chest: help someone in trouble. I stood there and thought of my daughter's teeth, of her tendency to fall asleep on my couch, of the phone call that had once asked me to come home. I didn't open it. I stayed put. The voice became 100 tiny glass beads hitting the floor, and then it stopped. In the morning, there was no one at the back door.
The red mailbox was gone. The travel mug was missing from the plate, as if the picture had swallowed its offering and moved on. The log read, 0042 knock, child voice, no entry. We wrote no entry, as if that sealed our virtue. Not every test was external. Rule 5. If you see yourself in person in an image, close your eyes immediately and count down from 50, felt like a guardian breathing down my neck. There was the night I woke in the gallery because the motion alarms had tripped. I was half asleep on the hallway bench, the heat of my jacket cooling, when a figure appeared at the far end of the gallery, very still and facing the portrait case. It looked like me in the distance, only its posture was wrong, turned toward the plate as if in prayer. Adrenaline made the world quick and clean. I thought of the rule and the self's temptation to meet another self. I closed my eyes, counted the numbers in the dark like stepping stones, and when I opened them, the figure had slid away, like a coin being returned to someone's pocket. Afterward, I slept with my Casio under my pillow, the numbers against my ribs. I would wake and think of the other me in a silvered world, and the idea of being on two ends of a divide that could be crossed by the wrong kind of attention made me physically tired. By the time Leonard suggested tests, we were not only observers but a small cohort of keepers,
people who had turned avoidance into the profession of their lives. He wasn't satisfied with the rules alone. Rules are instructions. He wanted mechanisms. He sketched an apparatus on the back of a shipping invoice, a pulse generator tuned to cancel the resonance he believed the meteorite-contaminated silver could produce. Think of it as hitting the bell at the exact counterfrequency to make it fall quiet, he said. In his head, the Guardian was a tuned instrument, and he meant to play it contrary to itself. We tested parts in the lab with copper coils and modified capacitors. Harold mounted the tintype into a jig so small vibrations could be introduced without damaging the emulsion. They called it sub-vibration testing to keep the donors calm. Leonard spoke in frequencies and harmonics, in the way a person who has lived a long time with math can make a motion sound like a diagram. He warned us, repeatedly, that the pulse had to be precise. Not too weak, or nothing would happen, not too strong, or the effect might propagate and do harm in a way none of us wanted to imagine. He said, "We have to remember we're not destroying anything. We're trying to change the state. We want coherence to fall apart, not explode." There was a question that lay in everything we did. If you broke the trap, if you opened the door, what would come out? Would the people inside step back into time with the soft bewilderment of someone who wakes from anesthesia, or would they be hollowed-out versions of their former selves, stitched with memories that couldn't belong to the now?
The answer mattered for how we kept the rules. If the trapped were alive and salvageable, it argued for bolder intervention. If not, it argued for containment. What kept me on the night rounds was not curiosity alone, but a sense of duty that had become a kind of penance. I had a scar above my left eyebrow from falling off my bike when I was 9. It was a small, silly thing, but whenever I caught its angle in a shop window, I felt accountable to the boy who bled there. The divorce in Wichita and the gaps that remain after someone leaves teach you what loneliness does to the body. You start to see yourself in places you shouldn't. The museum gave me a role that was bigger than being a man trying to fix his life. It made me a steward of people who might be dragged into being stuck. We tightened the rules, wrote updates, and laminated warning signs in 5 languages. We kept the public out of the wing that housed the problematic plates. Yet the world leaks. People do strange things. A donor walked in one morning and insisted on seeing his great-grandmother's likeness. He argued with Dr. Grant until she, who was usually immovable, consented to a supervised viewing. He stood 3 paces away and gazed until the muscles in his jaw looked as if they might rearrange. The man later collapsed in the lobby, eyes glassy, telling us he had seen his wife as a child inside the frame and that she asked him to bring her back. We called security. We called the ambulance. The man was distraught and kept saying the words, "I promised you," in loops. That night, the news spun rumors about haunted photography. Leonard went on record to call it an anomalous feedback phenomenon. We sat in our back office and listened to the hum of the building, and Dr. Grant closed her eyes and asked the 2 most practical questions. How many contaminated plates might there be, and what happens if a professional photographer tries to step in to fix them? The practical questions opened the map. Harold had an index of plates the photographer in question likely used. Leonard argued, with that scientist's ruthless courtesy, that if there was particulate contamination at a site like Brenham, call it Brenna for the sake of archival clarity, then the problem could be regional. He said it with the same difference men use when they are delivering bad medical news. "We can't assume one plate," he warned. "We can't assume one gallery." That sentence made the rules more than local lore. They became triage for a potential contamination that might not be contained to our museum. If plates from the same era had used metal from the same field, if certain itinerant photographers had carried their supplies across counties, then do not take photographs of plates made before 1900, scaled from a local admonition to a possible public safety directive. I should have been outraged at the idea of locking away parts of history.
Instead, I was tired in a way that a man with a long night job understands. The kind of tired that makes you accept anything if it promises to keep people intact. There was a moral calculus you don't teach in school, the multiplication table of harm. If 1 saved life equals 1,000 preserved artifacts, what do you choose? If you destroy an object to save a person, do you honor the living or the dead? We argued. We wrote memos. We drew circles around the plates we considered high risk and prepared a catalog of them for regional communication. Dr. Grant took to calling other museums, softening her tone and asking them to check their inventories for suspicious plates or for any record of a silver supplier from the site period. People on the other end of the line said, "We'll check," with a skepticism that was part due diligence and part reflex. And for all of that, the rules continued to be what kept the immediate threat at bay. I repeated them like coordinates. They became a pragmatic faith. Rule 1, do not enter the affected gallery after hours. Rule 2, do not answer voices calling from inside once the museum is closed. Rule 3, cover or remove all reflective surfaces in the gallery and adjacent rooms. Rule 4, do not under any circumstances take photographs of plates made before 1900 or allow yourself to be photographed with them. Rule 5, if you see yourself in person in an image, close your eyes immediately and count down from 50. If any of that reads like a manual for cowardice, consider the alternative. There are nights when I walk the cases and imagine the trapped. There are nights when I look at the woman's Casio and think of my daughter's chipped front tooth. There are moments when the human part of me wants answer and rescue so badly that the rules jostle like a cage. That's when the doors close in my head, and the only thing that keeps me upright is the knowledge that breaking a rule can cost someone a life. If you've watched this through the haze of a late hour and you like strange museum stories, hit subscribe. There are more things in these rooms than dust, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. After the early tests, the pattern tightened. The plate began to carry messages. One morning, Dr. Grant noticed a small scrap of paper in the woman's lap, impossible to have been there the night before. A tiny slip scrawled with a single line of handwriting in a shaky ink. We all leaned in and read. The three of us in the back room with the light low. Help me, 3 days. There are phrases you cannot ignore. Help me is among them. The 3 days looked like a timestamp, an urgent tally. In the kind of logic Leonard had been sketching, the plate had not only been accumulating artifacts, it had been sending us a notice, or perhaps the people inside had been making a small, contingent attempt at communication across the silvered gulf.
That lint of paper forced a new question. If messages could pass out, could we pass back? If bridges could form in attention, perhaps the right counterfrequency could make them unfurl. Leonard began to move beyond theory and into design. He fashioned a portable pulse generator, a rough assembly of coils and capacitors, and a battery pack kept in a road case. The thing humored me with its simplicity: copper loops mounted on a plywood frame, an interface of dials that looked like something a ham radio enthusiast would be proud of. When Leonard turned the dial and the coils thrummed, the room changed the way a day changes before a thunderstorm. The air thickened, light sharpened. "This is not a club," he said. "This is not a guarantee. This is a test. We will need a person to act as distraction during deployment, someone to take attention at the moment of pulse so that the resonance doesn't simply shift." He looked at me. He always looked at me on nights like that, the way the night makes you small and the man with engineer hands big. I thought of the scar above my brow. I thought of the woman with my Casio in her lap. I thought of a slip of paper with 3 days written on it. Duty and curiosity pulled at me in different directions, both strong, both shameful. I told myself I could refuse. I told myself the rules were to be followed. But the rules are not only for keeping distance, they are for knowing when distance is cowardice. The thought that someone could stay trapped because I was too afraid to test a machine was heavier than the fear of a tall, thin thing in the dark. If you had asked me the night I agreed, I would have told you I didn't know what would happen. I told Leonard I would do it, but the truth was smaller and grittier. I wanted the plate to stop adding things from my life. I wanted the museum to be a place of history and not a mirror that rearranged the bones of it. I wanted to be able to walk past the portrait without seeing my daughter's outline in the margins of anachronism. We began preparations. Dr. Grant arranged for the gallery to be evacuated and sealed. Harold made a new mount for the plate so it could be accessed without touching the emulsion. Leonard adjusted the pulse generator, calibrating frequency in the way a man recalibrates his breathing when he swims too far out. I read the rules one last time out loud, like a litany, making sure every word lodged in me. Rule 1. Do not enter the affected gallery after hours. Rule 2. Do not answer voices calling from inside once the museum is closed. Rule 3. Cover or remove all reflective surfaces in the gallery and adjacent rooms. Rule 4. Do not under any circumstances take photographs of plates made before 1900 or allow yourself to be photographed with them. Rule 5. If you see yourself in person in an image, close your eyes immediately and count down from 50. The rules sat between us like a thin glass, and then, between the last words and the first turn of the generator dial, something low hummed in the walls. It wasn't the machine at first. It was as if the building itself was a throat clearing. The lights in the hall dipped, and a cold crawled under the gallery doors, where I could see faint breath fogging the edges. After that breath, the tests stopped being small. I remember hitting the switch on my little annoyance device, something to make a small rhythmic clicking on my belt so the Guardian would have to notice me. The plan was simple and terrifying. I would be bait, visible in the corridor, a source of attention. Leonard's generator would be run from the administration room, and when the pulse hit, he hoped the resonance would collapse the bridge and release whatever was bound. The risk was twofold. If the pulse failed, the Guardian might notice and take someone. If it was too strong, the energy could propagate unpredictably. We had rehearsed the contingency plans, but rehearsals are a polite fiction compared to actual terror. When the night came for the trial, the museum smelled like ozone and old wool. Dr. Grant's face was a hard, beautiful thing. Harold kept muttering to the plate as if you could coax a camera with petulant words. Leonard ran last-minute checks and handed me a small foam earplug for one ear. To blunt mimicry, he said, because voices had been good at unspooling the next step. I stood in the corridor, the device a small, obnoxious metronome clipped to my belt. I was meant to be seen. I was meant to be what the Guardian could attune to without actually entering the gallery. The thought of what it would be like to be chosen came back with an animal clarity. I thought of locks, and of my Casio, and of the scar above my left eyebrow. I thought of my daughter in Wichita with a mouthful of baby teeth and old photos, and I thought of the woman on the plate with a watch that did not belong. When Leonard began the count, the world narrowed. The hum of the coils filled the building like a migrating insect. I kept my eyes on the sealed gallery door. I kept my hand on the metronome switch. I breathed. The rules were behind me like a backstop, but they do not prevent fear. They only tell you where the edge is. We were about to find out whether rules protect or imprison. The night air outside the building was a hard black smear. Above us, the Midwestern sky was indifferent. Inside, the light hummed and Leonard's coils sang a low, waiting note. I felt my metronome click under my fingers like a small, stubborn heart. Leonard counted down. He had that engineer's calm that I found both reassuring and slightly terrifying, like someone who has rehearsed disaster in his head until it looks like a neat problem. 10 seconds. He looked at me without impatience. "Be seen," he said. "Be visible, but do not draw across the line." I clipped the little annoyance device on my belt. The thing was silly, a child's clicking toy rewired to a commercial metronome. It made a steady, infuriating tick. That tick was my job. Be motion, be focus, be a small living thing the Guardian could orient to without needing to stretch into the gallery. "Remember the rules," Dr. Grant said, voice calm and sharp. She read them slower than usual, as if pronunciation alone might sanctify them. Rule 1. Do not enter the affected gallery after hours. Rule 2. Do not answer voices calling from inside once the museum is closed. Rule 3. Cover or remove all reflective surfaces in the gallery and adjacent rooms. Rule 4. Do not, under any circumstances, take photographs of plates made before 1900 or allow yourself to be photographed with them. Rule 5. If you see yourself in person in an image, close your eyes immediately and count down from 50. I repeated them to myself like a benediction. Harold had the plate in its new mount. Leonard's generator hummed through the vents, a trellis of copper coils and taped capacitors that seemed too human and too crude for what we were asking it to do. Dr. Grant had sealed the wing. The security cameras relayed small, grainy rectangles of the corridor and the museum's administrative hub. When Leonard finally threw the switch, it was with the casual finality of someone flicking a kettle. The coils filled the air with a pressure that pressed on the teeth in my jaw. Light seemed to sharpen along the picture frames. Outside the sealed gallery door, a condensation fog smudged the seams like breath. My annoyance device kept its steady tick. I breathed with it. There was a shift that came not at once, but like a swallow going down. The temperature dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the HVAC. It was a cold that moved along the skin. The lights dimmed minutely, as if the museum were pulling a thin blanket over itself. And then the sound came. A long, soft, dragging noise from inside the case, like linen being stroked across metal. The Guardian, Leonard had been careful to say, was not a thing we could box with adjectives. But in the moment, it revealed preferences. It preferred the undercurrent of attention to raw violence. It liked shapes that suggested abandoned motion, a hand halfway through the tying of a shoe, a mouth paused on a laugh. When we shoved frequency at it, it did not scream. It adjusted. It reached. I felt it before I saw it, a thin pressure across my arms,
like someone sitting very close and leaning in. My annoyance device clicked, and I felt the sound try to pull my attention outward toward the sealed door.
The temperature at the edge of my vision crystallized, and a shadow moved against the frame of the case. It was long and thin, a smear with elbows that seemed too far from any shoulder. The shadow rubbed at the edge of the glass as if it were trying to feel the texture of air. We had rehearsed a script where the pulse collapses the bridge and the trapped step free like people waking. That rehearsal had not accounted for anger. The Guardian did not like being interrupted. It had been comfortable in its folded hour. The generator's counterfrequency must have rung across whatever resonance it was resting on. Instead of releasing peacefully, it tugged to keep the world in place. The first thing to happen visibly was the plate itself. The woman's eyes, composed of silver fleck and shadow, seemed to contract. For a breath, she looked like a lens catching a distant sun. Then the emulsion gave a little shudder, and the modern things she'd been collecting, the Casio, the earbuds, the paper cup, blinked as if they were specimens in an aquarium responding to the change in chemistry. A hairline fissure showed across the lower corner of the plate. Not a crack in the glass, but in the way light met silver, a seam where tension knifed through. "He's holding," Leonard called. "Stay on it. Keep the metronome. Do not look into the case." Rule 3, cover reflective surfaces, was easy to obey in that rush because we had practiced doing it until it felt like muscle memory. But obeying a rule in rehearsal is one thing. Obeying it when something presses against the membrane of your life is another. The coils thrummed, and the space seemed pregnant with voices not yet spoken. Then the mimicry began. A child's laugh from far off, the exact cadence of a woman calling somebody's name, a voice like my own whispering the numbers of my social security. Voices looped, overlapped, and slid off one another like fish in a net. The Guardian used its favorite tricks, the comfort of remembered phrases, the little precisions that locate us in memory, and wove them into a chorus. My earplug helped. It blurred the voice mimicry into a suggestion and removed the razor edge of perception. I kept the metronome clicking. My fingers kept the switch engaged, ready to trigger something Leonard had told us might be necessary, a secondary surge to force the resonance to invert. The corridor lights flickered. The shadow across the plate gained an outline, and then, shockingly, an arm. It was wrong in the way life is wrong when grafted from other people's limbs, too long for its own shoulder, joints that seemed to fold the wrong way. It pressed fingers to the inside of the glass, and the print of those fingers left no condensation but a darker hollow, as if the silver remembered touch.
Something inside my head considered climbing the steps and giving it what it wanted, partly because of curiosity, and partly because the weather of guilt that lived over me said maybe if I touched it, might return what was taken. Then I smelled something else, sulfur under dust, an old candle's burnt edge. The smell made my stomach twist. I thought fiercely of Rule 2. Do not answer voices calling from inside once the museum is closed. That rule had kept me from opening a door before. Now it kept my hands from reaching toward a glass that wasn't glass, but a membrane. Someone screamed. Not a survival scream from someone stepping out of a picture. No, it was lower and older, the sound of a fabric tearing inside a closet. The skeleton of the thing moved like a reed in shallow water. It wasn't yet fully there. It was hungry and surprised to find it had to fight. Leonard's coils climbed their curve, and he adjusted dials by feel. One of the capacitors popped and hissed steam that smelled faintly of hot metal. "Now," Leonard called. I pushed the secondary surge. It was blunt and fast, a brief wallop of a frequency into the room. At the same moment, Harold hit another switch on the mount, gently ejecting the plate from its immediate resting gorge in the holder so we could break the resonance without physically touching the emulsion. For a second, the air went thin in a way I can only call cold silence. The hum collapsed like a drawn curtain. The light in the gallery brightened like the world taking a breath. The plate flipped, if that's the right way to say it. It flickered from the inside, and then there was a sharp crystalline sound like a carabiner unclipping. The silver stopped behaving like a skin and acted instead like a door opening. People poured out. Not literally poured, but the photospace collapsed and left bodies where there had been only flat light. The first person who stepped free was a woman in a long skirt and a cardigan that smelled of starch and tea. She blinked like a drowned thing and then sat on the plinth, trembling. Her hair was pinned in a way that belonged to another century, but her shoes were filthy sneakers that had never been made in 1873. She cried without volume at first, just tears that ran steady as a faucet. Dorothy Yost was the second to appear. When she stood, she looked older than the others by that peculiar arithmetic of a life compressed. She wore an apron dusted with flour and clutched a tin that had Samuel stamped on the lid. She looked at us as if we had suddenly become part of the dream she had been holding. She saw me, and then her eyes narrowed in recognition. "You," she said, voice thin and astonished. "You're the man with the watch. You didn't come."
That was when the other Wyatts stepped out. There were two of them, staggered like echoes. One was a young man with a face like mine, but smoother, with skin stretched taut and the old scar above the left eyebrow absent or differently healed.
He held something white and trembling in his hands, a small slip of paper like the one Harold had found. On it were 4 earnest marks that looked like tally marks, and the word "help" scrawled across the top in slanted pen ink. The other was a man I recognized from my reflection, only thinner, paler, and with the same Casio on a wrist that had no business being there. He looked terrified, and when he saw me, his face changed from horror to something that reached through me with fingers. "You let me out," he said. His voice had the static edge of someone who had been whispering to himself for a long time. You promised you'd count." I didn't think. A rule is ceremonial until someone you know, or some version of yourself you recognize, needs you to break it. Rule 5 leapt to mind. If you see yourself in person in an image, close your eyes immediately and count down from 50. I had lived by it. I had practiced it until the numbers were a cheap comfort. But the man standing in the gallery was physically present, breathing like a person. He staggered toward me and clutched my jacket sleeve with fingers that left dust. "Close your eyes," I whispered, because the rule was the only language I had that could explain the moment. "Close your eyes and count." He looked like he couldn't hear. He shook his head as if shaking the room. He squeezed the paper into my hand. The paper was wet with something that could have been condensation or tears. His lips moved without sound, and then abruptly he closed his eyes and began to count. 50, 49, 48. He counted with a shaking voice, and as he descended, a visible wind seemed to pass over him. It was like watching someone rewind themselves out of a photograph into the messy blur of a human day. When he reached 0, he opened his eyes, and the first thing he did was look at me with a clarity that was dismaying and intimate. "You remember too," he said. His memory slid across me on a hand. For a half hour afterward, we sat under the emergency light and shared impressions that were not always welcome. He brought with him the taste of metal and stale gum, the memory of taking the photograph, the click of a plate, then a stretching of time that was mostly silence and the sound of the Guardian's breathing. He had been in there for 3 days, according to the slip, and those days had left a residue in his head. They shared with me images I had not experienced, and then some that bled into my own, being pressed against silver, seeing my own face flattened and preserved like a pressed flower, hearing voices call me from the other side and not being allowed to answer. Back in the corridor, the freed staggered, and we organized them like a rescue team without military training. Dr. Grant applying first aid, Harold checking for deeper trouble, Leonard monitoring the generator's cooling fans as if that were equivalent to tending a patient.
The survivors smelled of old clothes, of perfume from a time before the current decade, of a sweetness like molasses in December. They were confused in a way that demanded gentleness. Some of them we could call by name. Family histories and a bit of genealogical work matched portraits and donor files, and a few were strangers, possibly having been taken by itinerant cameras that no one had ever inventoried. Among the freed was a young soldier in a uniform that looked like it had seen 1943 in a way that cardboard can't show. He sat on the floor and sobbed, making fish-like noises of astonishment. Dorothy found herself hugging him, and then pulling away embarrassedly, as if a century-apart camaraderie had been demanded and accepted. There were small miracles that choked me up in a way I hadn't expected. One woman, thin, with a hat like a fan, touched the museum desk where a photograph of her husband sat and began to recite a child's nursery rhyme that her granddaughter would have known. She wept and then laughed, and her laugh was the strangest currency of the night because it felt like currency returning. But there was also a dark arithmetic to the rescue. Not everyone came back whole on the inside. Some had memories that belonged to other people. There was a man who claimed to remember being in a trench that smelled of earth, and then also recalled in sharp detail a child's school recital he had never attended. The merging of temporal experiences, of lives braided across impossible seams, was the cost of continuity. Leonard had warned us that coherence might reassemble in ways the present could not wholly accept. He used the word integration as if it were a medical term, which made it sound manageable, but the human toll was not manageable in any easy way. We were not in a mood to celebrate. Triumph felt small and bureaucratic amid the sobs and the helpings of water. The Guardian had been pushed back. If the coils did this, it was a displacement, not a defeat. The construct had been disturbed enough to let people step into the corridor. It had not been destroyed. "Where is it?" Dr. Grant asked, voice taut with a protectiveness that belonged to a woman who had spent her life keeping other people's memories in glass. Her eyes searched the eaves and the corners where the light pinched dark like a wound.
Leonard answered in the measured way of people who hold alarming hypotheses in their mouths gently. It didn't cease to exist. It recoiled. The pulse uncoupled the resonance state we were feeding. But resonance doesn't disappear. It redistributes. Think of heat moving from one place to another. We forced the system into a new configuration. The Guardian exists where energy is displaced. It will seek another folded place to nest. He avoided saying destroyed. No one liked the idea of a creature that could simply find another seam. That was too much like a hydra.
It was what kept me awake that night after the survivors were driven to the county clinic and the police had been called in to field questions they couldn't accept as science. The Guardian was not gone. We had merely shifted the burden. In the days after the operation, the museum became a place of traffic. Officials, public health, a state archivist, an unimpressed reporter came and asked questions. Family members arrived to claim the freed and to fit them back into narrative lines that had been paused for decades. A woman named Margaret came in 2 days later, handing Dr. Grant a yellowed photograph, and then holding Dorothy's face for a long minute like a map reading itself. They did not exchange many words. I watched from the lobby, hands stuffed in my jacket pockets, and felt the rightness of it. People meeting again. For Harold, the entire episode had been a confirmation of craft and terror. He was thrilled and shaken in roughly equal measure. He spent his hours cataloging the plate, taking meticulous notes about the fissure that had appeared, about the way the silver had responded to sub-vibration. For Leonard, the operation deepened questions that looked like larger problems. If contamination at the site had created localized resonant plates in multiple places, then our gallery's episode could be one of many. Dr. Grant articulated a plan that wasn't a plan so much as a long logistic. Screen the region's collections, contact other museums and private collectors, create a registry of suspect plates, institute a temporary ban on unsponsored photography of pre-1900 collections. It was bureaucratic and necessary. She also insisted that we never again let a member of the public view those plates unsupervised. The question that caught in my throat as we argued over ethics and preservation was what to do with the plates themselves. Some wanted to destroy them outright. The thought made me dizzy. We are custodians of memory and of objects that don't obey us. Destroying an artifact is both sacrilege and mercy. Dr. Grant insisted on containment and measurement. She wanted protocol. She wanted the plates cataloged and locked with access limited to teams with clearance. Destroying is final, she argued. Containment is reversible. This argument had moral weight if you valued both the dead and the living. Leonard, with his engineering itch, leaned toward cataloging and designing better pulses, systems of logistical response that could extract with minimal collateral resonance. Harold worried that our meddling had consequences we couldn't foresee. What if an alternate resonance formed and we created more complicated patterns that fed the Guardian in new ways? And then there was the personal calculus. I had become a man with new witness. In the weeks following the operation, I had nights where I could not sleep because the memory of being inside silver came back as a tactile thing.
I would wake with a metallic taste and a thin panic like a hand on my throat. My double's memories had mixed with mine in a way that felt like a smudge. I would be walking the galleries at 2 a.m. and remember, suddenly, the humiliating small terrors the trapped had endured. The sensation of light flattening a face so that edges were sharp. The way the Guardian fed on small temporal differences, nibbling at attention slowly, like a child picking at a scab. There were legal things, forms to file, statements to give to police, a call I had to make to Wichita that was the hardest number I had ever dialed. I told my daughter about the operation with a clumsy, careful script. I did not want to frighten her, or to give her more reasons to be wary of a father she already saw as a man in half. She listened, then asked a question children are perfect at. "Did you help them, Dad?" I said yes. She said good, in the kind of practical way children say yes to small moral actions. It mattered to me more than anything else in that week. There were public shivers. The reporter's story painted us as brave souls who had snatched people from time. Leonard's quotes were hedged in the paper. Harold's comments about wet plate processes got traction in photography forums. Dr. Grant received offers of funding and veiled threats from people who seemed more concerned about spectacle than about safety. We turned down some offers and accepted others. Funding solved practical problems and invited attention in equal measures. Months passed and we enacted the plan Dr. Grant had pulled into being.
We cataloged suspect plates and asked colleagues in neighboring towns to check acquisitions from late 19th century itinerant photographers. We convened a small panel of conservators and physicists to think about protocols for pulse use and criteria for when an intervention was justified. Screening became a duty. I found myself trained not just in locks and rounds, but in the careful reading of emulsion anomalies, in the kind of watchfulness that is half craft and half religious observance. I stayed on as night watchman. The museum needed someone who had seen the thing and chose to remain. There was a tacit faith in continuity that institutions understand. Dr. Grant insisted I keep a journal of anomalous incidents, and I did, in a small used ledger that smelled of pencil shavings and dust. I updated the laminated rules every time Leonard or Harold added a nuance. Rule 1 still held as the first and bluntest injunction: don't enter the gallery. It remained the spine. We closed the wing for public tours for a time, then reopened it with heavy signage and an information sheet that invited the curious to donate to conservation but not to peek behind the ropes. Tour groups still came, but now a docent in a navy blazer told the story in measured tones about the perils of preservation.
The narrative online mutated into legend, an urban folkloric version where the guardian was less a principal than a boogeyman. I disliked the sensationalism, but I recognized it as the way communities process risk. Sometimes in the slow hours at 2 in the morning, the old temptation returned. A car door would slam softly outside. My ears would prick at a child's laugh carried over frost. Once, on a bitter late-night round, I felt the precise shape of my daughter's face skirt the edge of my mind, laughing in a kitchen I will never be in. Old knots of longing still pull. That's the odd cruelty of guarding. The job requires you to hold yourself steady in the presence of people's needs, and to say no in the way a person administers pain to prevent worse injury. And then there were the new tasks. The museum assigned me the first responder role for any suspected plate incident. That meant I led the initial logging, the covering of reflective surfaces, the asking of the noisy, necessary questions. Had the plate been handled? Was there new accession? Who had been in the gallery after hours? I became proof of our own survival, a man with a scar above his left eyebrow who had once been both bait and savior. Every once in a while, someone would try to photograph a plate before 1900 with a digital camera. Visitors will be visitors. I would see their hands lift a phone and feel the old animal ache of a man who wants to touch the stream of his child's life. I'd step forward and say, politely but firmly, please don't. Those are closed collections. 9 times out of 10 they accepted the answer, mumbling apologies. Once a woman argued that her great-grandfather's portrait should be shared with her children. She was bitter and desperate in a way that didn't surprise me. Dr. Grant, with all her professional politeness, would meet her hand to hand, and sometimes offer a supervised view with a trained conservator and 2 people in aprons. That compromise felt like a moral vector some nights. We could make space for memory without making the living into bait. Leonard continued to work on the theoretical side. He built a better generator, wrote down equations with the same flinty zeal, and spoke to colleagues in cautious terms. Harold kept photographing plates for study, his lenses becoming instruments not of art alone, but of forensic observation. Dr. Grant organized a regional conference on contaminated silver, and we hosted colleagues from 3 states. We became a minor node in a network of people who worried about old metal and how attention might be a kind of currency. The Guardian, for its part, did not stay purely a shadow. It took forms that were less terrifying and more insistent. Once a maintenance door creaked near the basement furnace, and a pair of lights went out in the hallway for a minute. When the custodian opened the door, a length of shadow unfurled down the stairs, and then disappeared as if following a scent.
Harold and I watched the security footage later and saw a thin form that passed like a reed. Long arms, a quick hook of movement that looked almost mechanical in its grace. It did not wage open assault. It preferred edges and human littleness. The thing had, as Leonard feared, moved on. We adopted a new rule of our own. Watch the watchers. Pay attention not so much to the objects, but to the patterns of attention around them. Keep a record of who looks, how they look, what they bring into a room. The simple act of cataloging attention, of making it a variable in our conservation practice, felt like an absurd prophylactic, like washing hands against contagion. But it also calmed us by converting the chaotic into something we could measure and change. The moral decisions persisted. We declined to destroy contaminated plates, instead opting for containment protocols that weighed the life of a person, however long ago caught, against the cultural value of an object. People argued that we were favoring the living at the expense of material history. Others thought we had already favored the dead too much by keeping artifacts untouched. There was no clean answer. There was only a ledger of consequence and an unwillingness among us to treat the problem as something that could be fixed once and for all. Months later, a small band of newly freed people met in the community center to tell their stories. Dorothy returned, and she and Margaret sat together and traded fragments of recipes while a social worker arranged healthcare. The soldier re-enlisted in an absurd, bureaucratic way. He couldn't hold his place in the new world, so the old structure comforted him. There were reunions that were quiet and tender, a great-grandson meeting a great-grandmother who had been living in someone else's memory for decades and was resistant to being boxed into gratitude. I kept my ledger. On a page near the back, I wrote the 5 rules again, underlining them with a careful hand. They had saved lives. They had prevented worse. They did not, however, end longing or stop the Guardian from seeking other seams. They were a toolbox, not a prison. There were nights, rare and quiet, when the gallery's case was locked and I would stand across from it and let the Casio digits blink on my wrist and think of the man I had been before the plate drew my life into its orbit. I would pick up the metronome and let it tick once or twice, then stop. Sometimes I would close my eyes and count down from 50 even when no image faced me, just to remind myself of the discipline. One late winter night, after snow had made the city quiet and flattened the human noise into a compact hush, I found myself sitting in the empty lecture room with a cup of lukewarm coffee. The museum smelled like Manish and lemon oil.
Grant had left for home. Harold had gone to check on a donor's collection in the neighboring county. Leonard was drafting a paper that hesitated between careful hypothesis and naked curiosity. I was alone with the low, thoughtful hum of the building and a ledger that knew more than any one of us. I opened the drawer of the desk, the one with the small brass handle, and placed my Casio inside it. I slid the watch into a small square of cotton and shut the drawer. There was a small sensation of sealing something up that had power over me. It was a ritual, nothing more, but rituals are how people make private promises. I pressed my fingers to the top of the drawer and counted silently, 49, 48. It was a small, private joke to myself, a rule repeated in a new form. Outside, the museum lived. Visitors came and left with new stories. Donors gave in smaller and more cautious ways. Our wing remained under soft guard. We offered curated glimpses for people who needed to see their pasts upheld, and then returned to the work of waiting and watching. I had become part of the architecture of care. There are nights when I still hear the faintest of knocks, 3 slow raps, then 4 quick ones, in the woodwork of the old building. But now they arrive like an echo that might be residual from the time the thing had been let in. I stand still. I remember Rule 2 and place my palm flat against the old doorframe to feel the grain of the wood. I keep my eyes open for a long time, and then, if nothing else happens, I make my rounds under the sodium-hued light until the building's heartbeat matches the metronome in my chest. When the museum reopened to the public weeks later, it did so with a new transparency. We posted signage about preservation practices, about why some items remain unseen. We put an information leaflet next to the ticket desk that explained, in careful and not entirely sensational language, how certain plates could be contaminated and why we asked patrons to respect the restrictions. Visitors read the paper with knitted brows, and once in a while someone would step forward and say, quietly, "Thank you for keeping watch." I learned that watchfulness is not just about keeping others from harm. It is also about accepting responsibility for the small lives that land in your custody. The woman who walked into the gallery with a Casio on her wrist months after the incident stopped and looked me in the eye. She was older now, hair frosted at the temples. She told me she had come to look for someone she thought might be in our collection. I led her to the ledger and found an accession number, and explained as gently as I knew how that some items were closed to viewing. She held my hand for a second as if it were still a child she knew how to steady. "You're doing right," she said, and then left without protest. The Guardian remained an idea we did not treat flippantly. Leonard's papers circulated among cautious peers. Harold wrote a careful article on wet plate anomalies that became required reading in certain conservation circles. Dr. Grant continued to press for a national register. The small regional effort that had started in our back office evolved into a network of archivists and conservators who'd rather be embarrassed by a false alarm than quiet about a real threat. For me, staying was an act both of penance and of something softer, love, the small, habitual kind. I like the building at night. It keeps me steady. It is a place where history smells of lemon and old books, and where my soufflé of grief can be ironed flat by the rhythm of rounds and the certainty of a lock clicking behind me. Sometimes the loneliness is raw and literal. Sometimes it is a companion like the metronome's tick. I go to Wichita less now. My daughter sends pictures rarely. When she does, I frame them in my head so they do not pull at me when a plate suggests family. That is part of being on the watch. You protect your edges.
The rules remain pinned behind the security desk where any night guard can read them. They are our line, blunt and ungainly and life-saving. Rule 1. Do not enter the affected gallery after hours. Rule 2. Do not answer voices calling from inside once the museum is closed. Rule 3. Cover or remove all reflective surfaces in the gallery and adjacent rooms. Rule 4. Do not, under any circumstances, take photographs of plates made before 1900 or allow yourself to be photographed with them. Rule 5. If you see yourself in person in an image, close your eyes immediately and count down from 50. If you ever find yourself in the presence of a thing that wants your attention like a hungry dog, remember that saying no is messy and kind, and sometimes the only way to keep someone else alive. There are nights I wish the rules were simpler, nights when I would like to be brave in a way that isn't cautious. But bravery in our case might mean making a different person trapped to preserve a plate. I am not a man who can live with that trade-off anymore. Some months after the operation, Leonard wrote to say he'd found traces of the meteorite particulate at 2 other small collections in the state. We sent them a list of protocols, and Harriet at the Historical Society in the next county promised to keep an eye on their holdings. We did not cure the problem. No one claimed to destroy an omnivorous loom that folds time. We bought time to learn. Once, on a bitter evening, I opened the drawer where I kept a Casio and put the watch on my wrist for a while. The digits blinked their small blue vigilance. I counted my fingers by habit: thumb, forefinger, middle finger, an old private catechism at not being complete. My scar above the left eyebrow caught a streetlight that leaked in through the lobby window and flashed like a small personal lighthouse. The past is a geography you can read scars from.
If you want to do something after hearing this, do what we did in quieter ways. Support the people who keep public memory. Visit your local museum, donate to conservation, read about photographic preservation, and respect the rules the keepers post. Lockers and signs and humble medical-like protocols will not always be popular, but they keep people breathing. I wind the metronome, check my Casio, and make the rounds. I listen for knocks that sound like old patterns. If I hear a voice that calls my name in the particular way my mother used to, 3 slow raps, then 4 quick ones, I put my palm to the wood and remember the rules. The guardian is out there, in whatever form it prefers, patient and ready to be fed. Our duty is not to destroy beauty, but to protect the living from the ways history can hold them. When closing hours come and the museum hums like a living thing settling in its sleep, I walk past the old portrait and catch the empty case in my peripheral vision. The space that once held the plate is now a controlled archive, locked and cataloged. Once in a while I sit on the bench and count down quietly from 50 before I go to bed. It helps me remember how to say no. If you've been moved by this, please consider supporting your local museums and the work of conservationists who keep both people and objects safe. There are forums and fundraisers and quiet projects that could use a small hand. They do not invite headlines, but they do save lives. I keep watch. I always will. The building is older than me, and it will likely outlast my watch. For now, the Casio sits in my drawer when I am off duty, clean and deliberate. I open it sometimes at midnight, look at the blinking digits, and count my fingers one by one, until my mind is steady enough to sleep. The plates we guard will always have the potential to be more than photographs. Time has a taste, and some metals remember it. We learn that the hard way. The rules are simple. The work is not. The guardian is not a thing you make a pact with and then forget. It is a reminder that attention has weight, and that protecting the living sometimes means being the person who will not answer the door. I close the drawer, tuck the watch into its cotton, and turn off the lights. The museum breathes. The night is long, and I keep my rounds.